Hi there. In today's video I want to show you how you can get external geometry into Trimble Creator. So far in my other videos I've always worked with built-in geometry, and this time I want to get something in that I modeled in SketchUp beforehand and then do something with it, as in making it parametric like this here. Alrighty, so let's get started in a minute. Don't forget to check out my book Architectural Design with SketchUp. It covers all of these topics and makes for a great desk reference. You can find it where books are sold. There's also a link to it on my site, sketchupfordesign.com, together with lots of additional tutorials and news. Okay, let's get started. So what you can see here, of course, is my trellis model that I had created a while ago. It's made up of components, individual beams, posts, and so on and so forth. And I'm going to pull this into Trimble Creator. And let's just quickly step through my graph down here, because then I can show you a few of the principles that we're going to use. So for my particular one, this is more of an experimental thing. I have two file formats and I can switch between those. Ultimately, for a production piece, you wouldn't need to do something like this here. But you can pull a graphic in or any model in as an OBJ file, an object file, or as a TRB file, a TrimBIM file. This is a file format that Trimble uses in other applications and that they, I think, have developed. SketchUp itself, the SKP file format won't work. You can't pull a SketchUp file into this graph. So you always have to convert it at this point, at least. So I don't know what their plans are for the future, but at this point, that's the approach that you have to take. And then from that, we're going to have to do some cleanup. I'll show you why. And then we're going to reapply a material. In my case here, these plywood knots, as you can see, this is just a textured material right from SketchUp. But I'll show you some parts about that. And then at some point, we're going to do something with it. And I'm just going to do a very simple lengthening of this, which you can see right here. This wouldn't work in the other direction, and we'll discuss that a little bit, but I'll show you how Smart Size works, because that's a really cool node in Trimble Creator. All right, so that's the to-do list. Let's start with a clean slate. First thing, of course, is we have to get the geometry into Trimble Creator. And depending on which version of SketchUp you have different options, but let me show you one way to doing that. This is now in the Pro version, but the same workflow works in the web version as long as you have the full access, especially the OBJ export file format. All right, so here's my geometry. Like I said earlier, this is all componentized, all individual components like this here. Now, I'm going to go to File, Export 3D Model. And then from there, of course, I have to pick the OBJ file format, which is right down in the file selector right here. And now let's talk about options for that. What I've found is triangulating all faces works really well, better than not doing it. I didn't find a need for exporting two-sided faces. That usually means front side material and back side material, but in some of your cases that might be necessary. And I also didn't find a need to export edges. I'm going to export texture maps, even though, and I'll show you that in a second, even though you cannot pull a textured model into Trimble Creator, but it'll be useful because then I can retexture everything. The other bit that I found is Trimble Creator at this point, it works really well with millimeters, and starts to catch up a little bit on the other unit systems. But if you're using millimeters in Trimble Creator, then export your model as millimeters as well. Okay, so then I hit export. I'm going to cancel it because I already did that. And I'm going to pull this in. So now if you export as an OBJ file, then you get the OBJ file and you get a materials folder. And so then if you double click that materials folder, you'll see that there's basically your textures in there right here. Now, you may be tempted to highlight both and drag those into your graph, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to just drag in the OBJ file because, like I said earlier, you cannot pull a textured model into Trimble Creator this way. But the OBJ works perfectly fine. So all you need to do is click and drag. Once you land in your graph area, you see this little node appear, and then when you drop the file, the asset will be uploaded and it will be in your graph. And then of course you'll see something up here that hopefully resembles what you had. Now you see here that everything came in, but this node welding thing kind of smooths the whole thing out. So I'm gonna have to clean that up for one, but I'll do that in a minute. I just wanted to show you one way to get the geometry in here first. And now I'm going to show you another way, which uses this TrimBIM format. And if you've looked through the SketchUp exporter, of course, there's no such format available, at least at this point. And we have to do a little workaround. Fortunately, there's Trimble Connect. You may know about this. I hope you do. This is basically the online storage and collaboration platform that Trimble has. But you can export your SketchUp model right to this service. And once you have a login password for a user account, basically a Trimble user account for SketchUp, then you also have access to Trimble Connect, which is really useful because now you can use that for all kinds of other exchange things, and that's a topic for another video. But you can upload a SketchUp file, and that's exactly what I did here. So if you look to the bottom of my list here, Trellis was uploaded, and then in Trimble Connect, I can click that, and I get myself a web viewer. Again, has many different purposes than what I'm going to be using it for right now. You can view and annotate and to do and whatever, all of that stuff. But you see, of course, that the geometry came in. If you do this, then it won't be as fast as what I just did because it needs to process the upload. But once it's processed and it's in the system like this, there's a little trick you can do. You can go basically on the left side here under models, is this triple dot menu right here, and at the bottom you see download as TrimBIM. So that's one way to convert your file from SketchUp to TrimBIM. Then when I click that, it just gets downloaded right here. So that's one workflow. I'm assuming that'll change over time as things get easier, but for now that works. Okay, so let's get back to our Trimble Creator graph right here, and I'm gonna make a little space, and I'm actually gonna pull this into the same graph just so that I have it there. Ultimately, you wouldn't import two of the same models this way. Same thing as before. I'm gonna drag the file in, get myself a temporary node, drop the file, and now it's right there, right here. Okay, so now you see I've got both nodes highlighted, which is of course not what I want to show you. So now I highlighted only the TrimBIM, the second node right here. You see that on the bottom. For one, you'll see that the geometry comes in a little cleaner because it's already processed and cleaned up, and all of that stuff is really nice. So that's happening. And it's in there. Now you can do something with it. I'm actually going to just close this thing out if I can. There we go. And then do something with this. And again, depending on which version of SketchUp you have or what workflow you prefer, you can use either one of these. You may just have to clean things up. So I'm just gonna show you what happens if you have to clean the geometry. This is something that I did in my other videos too, where you have to, where you can then unweld vertices. Oh, and what I did just now, doing it intuitively already, is if you drag this little tab away from a node, to another node or into open space where you can then create a node, you're basically moving geometry data from one node to the other. And again, these dots here let you move data from one node to the other. But since I want to work with geometry, I'm going to do that. And now you see here we've unwelded the vertices, and then I find that this combination of unweld and reweld works fine, but for welding, now you got to give it an angle threshold that makes sense. Something like that. And now you got yourself some clean geometry to work with at this point back here. Again, if you highlight an individual node, you see everything up to that node. And then if I highlight my last node here, I get what I want to get. All right, so that's getting geometry in here. So now you may be tempted to add a material, and there's an interesting effect that happens when you add a material. So you can drag off from the last node here, and you can type in material, and you get yourself this node, which then, if you expand the inputs, gives you all of these here. You can set a color. There you go, and I can pick, I don't know, something. Those kind of things. But I can also set a base texture, and we have that wooden texture, and so now we can apply that at this point. When you have an external texture, as in an image file, you can actually get that right in here just the same way you get the geometry in. You just go to your image file, your JPEG, for example, but it does allow for other image files too. And I drag it in. And then there's a little upload time. Did it upload? I hope it did. Maybe it didn't. Let's give it another try. There we go. There's a little glitch in there. All right, right now here you see the file name appear. So now you know it's in there. Now you won't see anything in your model because I haven't done anything with it. But what I can do now is I can take the output of this and make that the base texture for my model. And then when I highlight the material, it should work. Oh yeah, right here. I still have to set the base texture. There. Okay, so now basically I took that image, moved it into the base texture, turned the base texture on, and it is there. Now, one thing that I found here is, depending on the input file, you get slightly different behavior. So I'm actually gonna delete this fin up front, and I'm actually gonna pull my TrimBIM file in right here. So I'm just disconnecting the OBJ file, and I'm going to pull the TrimBIM file into this workflow, and then or this graph. And then when I'm at the last node, you can see something really interesting happening, which is that first of all, the texture appears, but it also applies it with the correct UV coordinates that I had specified before. So this is an interesting behavior because in, maybe as a little aside here, in Trimble Creator, you can set UV projection for objects. You do this with this project UV node. But when you look at that, you'll see that you can basically just do a linear projection parallel to an axis. You can't do any of the others, spherical or cylindrical or whatever. And so then that wouldn't work so well on my model here, because then the texture would be okay on one side, but not on any of the other sides. So that's why it's actually quite useful that I don't have to work with project UV, because the UV coordinates and everything came in with my original file. Now this actually does work with the OBJ file too. It's just not shown in the viewer here. So later on I can show you how that looks in the actual project. So I'm just going to keep using the TrimBIM file for now. There's all of that, and I got even my textured model right in here. Okay, so now we've got the geometry in there. Now we got to do something with it. And I want to stretch this. And there is actually a really interesting node in here, which is called Smart Size. And for that to be parametric, obviously I'm going to need a parameter. So I'm going to go up here and I'm going to get myself a number parameter. Because now if I look at Smart Size, I can define an axis and I can define a size. So that's where I want to go into this. Okay, so now my number is going to be connected to the size. And again, now we're talking data to data. So I'm going to use this little dot. And then the number here has to become a parameter. So I'm right-clicking on it and I'm going to make that a parameter. All right, so now that parameter appears here to the left in my list of parameters, and I can now do this kind of thing. And it's interesting what you can do now with that. Obviously, you know, when I look at my trellis this way and I stretch it, as you saw down here along the x-axis, then this parameter isn't overly useful because all of the beams will be scaled. And ultimately, for something like this, you would actually want to set this up very differently. You most probably would want to have your base frame, the posts, and maybe these two beams here, set as one object, and then you would want to pull in these cross beams as a second object, and then come up with a logic in the graph to distribute those over the top evenly based on some rule, whatever, you know, spacing or something like this. So that makes much more sense in the X direction. So I'm going to skip that right now, knowing very well that you would want to set that. So I'm going to actually scale about the Y direction right here, because now this is actually quite doable all of a sudden. And, you know, this works for my model right now, but for other models, like I just said, you most probably will need to combine multiple input geometries and then work with them that way. Now, the other thing that I wanted to highlight here is the Smart Size node has not just the direction and the size, but also has this lock zone, which is a really interesting concept. So if I set this 2.1, then that means that 10% of your model in each of these ends in the Y direction will be held. And now when I stretch this, you see here that the beam ends actually held in their geometry, but now the posts stretch in an unreasonable fashion, just like that, right? So that does not, of course, not make sense. But if I increase this lock zone, and I gotta go here, I think 25 worked. Let's double check it. Then, oh no, it didn't fully work. So if you see here, that beam gets stretched, which makes no sense again. So we're gonna increase that to something different. Maybe, there we go. I don't know. Let's hold the thirds. And now when I stretch this, yeah, everything is fine. And basically just my beams stretch in the middle here. This is texture stretching, but for now I'm actually going to be okay with that. But, well, there you go. Now we've got something that smartly stretches in one direction. And there are some things that we want to do with something like this. Yeah, for one is there should be like a minimum, logic right here, because you see that, of course, I can get negative, and that makes no sense at all. So now I'm going to go back to my graph, and I'm going to, well, actually, let's keep this on right here. I'm going to go to number, and within number, I can now set this minimum to let's say 2000 right there. Again, we're in millimeters here. And adjust as needed, but now you see here in my parameters that I can't go below that. So that most probably makes sense. And then stepwise, I don't know, maybe I want to step this thing in increments like this. I always get some round numbers here. Anyways, you can adjust that, of course, as much or as little as you want. And then, of course, I most probably will want to rename number to, I don't know, length. Let's do that. And then, of course, my parameter makes sense down here. And I can now increase that as much as I want to. So that's one way to work with geometry. Again, this is a very simple example. And for anything more complex, you can do different things. Actually, one feature that comes in very handy that I had in my original node here, because I'm still working with these two input files, is the switch node, where you can switch between two things, and you can then add a parameter, basically, which is a choice. And you can give it values, and then that choice drives the switch node to go between two maybe inputs. You might have two different versions of something, two different versions of a chair or something like this, that you can then switch between, and then output that at the end. So that's another way to work with this. Alrighty. So I hope this was useful, and you can experiment with this as much as you want to. And of course, the next step from here is the same as before. So I'm not going to fully go through this, but you would save it, of course, in Trimble Creator. Then you would click on Open in SketchUp, and then you would move this over to SketchUp. But as you can see here, we already have geometry. We've got imported geometry. We've got the correct textures based on the UV data that came in from that file, and we've processed it a little bit, and then scaled it and give it a parameter. All right, so that's a little intro to how you can use external geometry that you've created in SketchUp, for example, or other software for that matter, in Trimble Creator, and how you can make live components from this existing geometry. All right, hope this was useful. Enjoy, have fun with this. See you all soon.